So when we focus on the functionality of riparian systems, we often talk about the three-legged stool concept, the old milking stool, where if one of those legs breaks, you're sitting on the floor. The vegetation slows the water, allowing sediments to become floodplains and soil. The sponge that holds water to grow the water-loving vegetation that has the root systems that bind stream banks to keep the form that we need for the function. That three-legged stool concept is fundamentally important to riparian proper functioning condition. So we talk about and observe the attributes and processes in various riparian areas. We do that by, in order to understand the potential of a given place, in order to understand the condition of a given place.
I think we may be at break time.
So there's a set of, John says he thinks we may be at break time, and I think he's probably about right. Looks like my voice is beginning to crack. I probably need to take a bit of a break. So let's get back together in about 10 minutes. Let's say 8:55. Does that work for everybody? So I will tune back in at 8:55, and I will go back.
All right, this is John McCann, and we've got, well, now 8:56 on our clock, so we're going to jump back into this. Hopefully we got everyone back from their break, stretching their legs and all that. So as Sherm was starting to talk about, we get into this three-legged stool of PFC that includes soil, water, and vegetation. And what we're going to run through now is basically the crash course in sort of how streams work. You know, this is something that folks go to school for weeks or semesters or even years to learn some of this stuff, but we're going to try to get through it pretty quickly. We're not going to give you all of the details or all of the potential combinations or variations, but we just want to make sure everyone's aware of the types of characteristics or variables that you run into in different stream systems. And you want to try to assess at every one of the streams that you go to where on the spectrum of these different variables they fall in their current status, and then where you think they should be if they were at sort of a highly functioning level or at potential or a step past that at the potential natural community. So starting here with the geology, geomorphology, and topography. So this is basically the shape of the area overall, and that includes the channel itself and what the channel is flowing through. So what are we looking at sediment-wise? Are we flowing across hard rock, bedrock that's really resistant to erosion, or are we looking at surficial deposits, and then what kind of deposits are they? Is it sand, silt, clay, gravel, boulder, that sort of thing? Valley bottom geometry, are we in a V-shaped canyon? Are we in a U-shaped canyon? Are we on an alluvial fan? Are we down in a big flat valley? What are the watershed properties? Are we you know, fairly steep all the way through the watershed? Is it fairly flat? Is it what's the overall size? So, you know, how much precipitation is it catching? So that has pretty good control on how quickly or to what extent water moves through the watershed from the time it hits the ground to the time it gets to your reach. Bank and bed stability, this ties back to you know, the bedrock and surficial deposits type question. Are we resistant to erosion based on the material that we've got and therefore highly stable, or are we susceptible to erosion? And if it's the material that's causing that stability or instability, or is it vegetation that's causing that stability or instability? But vegetation is a question we'll look at later. Sediment characteristics, again, you know, is it sand, silt, clay, but then also what's the mixture of those materials? Do you have variability? Is it well sorted? Is it poorly sorted? Do you have stratification in there? And then channel characteristics, so this is the shape of the channel itself. So what's the cross-sectional area? You know, is it shallow and wide? Is it narrow and deep? What's the bankful width overall? So that's sort of from one side to the other at flood stage. Pattern is looking at on the ground, you know, what's the shape of the channel as it moves through the valley. Sinuosity, that's how curvy the channel is, and then gradient is pretty self-explanatory. How steep is your stream? as you move through your reach, and recognizing that there are some minor changes in gradient as you go through a reach. Riffles are going to be steeper, pools are going to be flatter, but over a couple of sets of that pool riffle complex, what's the gradient of your stream? And then floodplain accessibility and extent. Do you have a floodplain at all? Some channels don't build a floodplain because they're not in a depositional environment. But if you do have a floodplain, are your flood flows actually hitting it, or have you had some incision and now that floodplain has turned into a terrace? And then how wide are those floodplains? Do you have only about a foot or two on each side of the channel, or are you looking at something like the Humboldt River where you've got, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of feet on either side, if not up to a mile or more, to help hold those flood flows back? So this idea of bankful, if you haven't heard of that before, it's also kind of referred to as effective discharge. And what we're talking about here is a discharge volume over time, so an amount of water, an amount of energy that's coming through your site that happens frequently enough that it does a good bit of work, but it's large enough that it can really do some big work. I liken this to if you were moving out of your house and you had some people helping. If you've got, you know, your kids or nieces and nephews helping you move, and they come inside and they grab a pillow and they move it out, and then they come inside and they grab a notebook and they move it out. They're moving little bits of things all the time, but that's really not that effective in really helping pack up the whole house. You may have some buddies come over and they help you move the fridge out, but then they're done. You know, they leave. But it's you who is there packing everything into boxes, so you're doing sort of that medium amount of work, but you're doing it enough that you're the one that really has the effect of unpacking or packing up and moving your house. So we've got these floods, or these just discharges that happen fairly frequently, these lower flows, but they don't carry a whole lot of sediment. We have these really catastrophic flows that happen, you know, every 50 or 100 years, and they really can change a system. But it's those ones that happen, you know, every, you know, a couple of times every 2 to 3 years that are moving enough sediment, and it happens frequently enough that they really are the driver in building and shaping your channel and your floodplain. So here we've got the lane-bore imbalance, which gets into the idea of within stream systems, there's a relationship between all of the parameters you can see on here: sediment size, the amount of sediment, stream slope, the amount of water. As you change one of the things on either side of that balance, you'll see that arrow there in the middle. It's either going to lean towards aggradation, which is deposition of sediment, or degradation, which is erosion of sediment. So again, just looking at this in words instead of a picture here, all of those factors are interacting. So if you increase slope, you're going to increase your velocity, which changes your ability to erode sediment, so your sediment size might change. If you start eroding, you're going to change your width and depth ratio. You may take your fines out, change your roughness. So all those things start to change, and as you change one of the variables in that equation, it's likely that some of the others are going to adjust to help bring that system back to either a full equilibrium where it's kind of stable, or sort of this exaggerated process back toward equilibrium where you have a system where it kind of gets worse before it gets better, sort of a thing. So one thing to think about is that high sediment systems tend to stay wider, and a classic example of this is glacial outwash systems. We obviously don't have any of those here in Nevada, but those are just sediment dominated. There's sediment coming down all of the time. They don't have a chance to really create a stable channel in the middle of that, so they're depositing. Every time a flow comes down, it deposits sediment. That channel picks up and moves, and so it stays super wide. But here's an example here, especially on the right here. This is up in Elko County, I believe. This was a system where management was changed. The system in the photo was starting to gain some function back, but there was a large sediment input coming in from the upper watershed. So instead of having a single narrow channel down through there for a while, that large sediment input created that channel to be shallow and very wide. So then we move into more of the water side of things, so climate and hydrology. What are we looking at to help define our system in regard to when we get water, how we get water, how long that water sticks around, and how it moves through the system? So are we snowmelt dominated? Are we thunderstorm dominated? Do we have a lot of spring inputs so that our discharge is fairly constant throughout the year? What's that runoff, infiltration, and base flow relationship? So when we do get a thunderstorm or snow melt, does that water just move through the system and you never see it again? Or do you get a lot of infiltration into the non-rock material within your watershed that then slowly moves through the ground and feeds back into that channel slowly throughout the year? And then you move down into that idea of hydraulic control, so that can be natural or man-made. How are they controlling the way water moves through the system? And then temperature there too, so that on the one hand can relate back to whether or not you're getting snow or rain, but then you can also take that back to more of the values that you may be getting out of the stream in regard to a fisheries habitat. Is your water a cold water system, or is it more of a warmer water system based on where you are in the landscape and the types of habitat that water is flowing through, and then the interaction of that water with what's subsurface? Being in Nevada, we've got a lot of geothermal inputs to some of our systems, so just because a stream may be warm doesn't mean that it's degraded. So here's a hydrograph of the South Fork Humboldt River near Elko County. So this is just a demonstration of looking at some historical data to help get a sense of what the overall water movement through a system looks like. And in this system, you know, it's a lot of data compressed in, but you can see there's annual variation, and it's a fairly similar pattern every year, although over time we see some years are higher, some years are lower. But what we see is sort of this slow ramp up to the highest discharge in the year, and then a pretty quick drop off after that. And that makes sense in parts of Nevada where we've got a snowmelt dominated system that through the spring, as the snow melts, adds water to the streams. But then once that snowmelt is gone, we don't get a whole lot of precipitation through the summer to keep adding to that base flow. So good having an idea of what your stream system looks like over the long term like that helps you define what type of potential your stream might have. And then on to that third leg of the stool, so vegetation here, so community types and distribution. So most streams don't necessarily have, you know, a perfect pattern of vegetation that is uniform as you move up or downstream or from one bank to the other. There's usually some sort of mosaic. What's the wetland indicator status of those plants? And again, this is the plants that are there currently versus the plants that you might expect to see. So, and then as you move away from the stream, you usually expect that wetland indicator status to change a little bit, being from, you know, more fully wetland status at the edge of the stream and then moving through facultative and then upland plants. And then again, that the type of hydrology you've got helps define that. If you've got a system that is perennial, you expect more of the full wetland indicator plants. If you've got a system that's maybe a little more intermittent, you may see more of the facultative or upland plants kind of creeping in as a percentage of that plant assemblage. And then with the disturbance dynamics and succession, most of our stream systems are adapted to some level of disturbance. Here in Nevada, it could be floods, or it could be large-scale fires, or in some places it could be beaver or browse from you know, whether it's livestock or native animals. And there's some amount of that disturbance that most of these streams can handle and then recover from. So where are you in that process? Have you had that disturbance and now you're recovering, or are you at sort of the peak version of that successional status? Recruitment and production, so are you actually getting plants to grow back after they've been disturbed, and whether that disturbance is human-based or not? What's the survival of those plants? So you may have, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new trees growing every year, but if none of them make it to sort of middle-aged or old age, then you may have a problem there in that idea of recruitment and reproduction and survival there. And then what are the rooting characteristics? That ties back a lot to the wetland indicator status. Most of our wetland plants are really adapted to have these root systems that are very resistant to shear stress and erosion, and we'll talk about that a little more later too. So we talked about wetland indicator status, but our wetland plants are hydrophilic plants, so hydro being water, philic being loving. They really thrive in particularly wet locations. And here in Nevada, we think of, anytime we've got water, that's a pretty easy place for plants to grow. But the fact that you've got moving water can make it a pretty harsh system to live in. Or if you've got slow-moving groundwater, that can be a little bit of a harsh system too, compared to what most plants are adapted to. So these hydrophilic plants have some features or functions that they have adapted to help deal with these situations. Here's an example of a soil core from a wetland area where you've got groundwater present year-round through a portion of that soil column where you've got the glade soil, right? So we've got completely sort of anoxic conditions where it's completely dark there. As you move up above that, you see that redox condition. So we've got a little bit of reduction, a little bit of oxidation. That shows that there's a little bit of fluctuation of the groundwater level right at that point, and that helps you figure out what your actual wetland characteristics are throughout the year. But those anaerobic conditions that exist through there, a lot of plants aren't adapted to deal with that. They actually need some oxygen down by the roots. So some of these wetland plants are adapted to deal with that, and one of the ways that they can do that is through this kind of spongy growth feature, and they call that feature arenchyma. It kind of describes the sort of soda straw down through the plant, and that helps actually draw oxygen from the air down into that saturated soil. And then if you're a plant growing along a stream, you're subjected to high shear stress, and if you don't come up with roots that can hold yourself in place and hold your soil in place, you're going to have a bad time. So a lot of these wetland plants have really dense, really strong root systems that include this feature called a rhizome. So it's sort of a modified root or modified stem that grows laterally underground, and then they can pop up new leaves from that. And some of those roots and rhizomes are incredibly strong, and in certain plant assemblages, they can be as strong as their solid rock or concrete, which is pretty impressive. But then again, those roots only go down so far. You can see in the top left there, we've had some incision. I think that's actually a picture of an area that was behind a beaver dam, and then the beaver dam blew out, and so you had the water level drop. And even if you've got those roots, though, if you have incision below the bottom of those roots, then the function of those roots goes away. We've got the idea of green line here when it comes to vegetation. You can read the definition here, the first perennial vegetation that forms as a lineal grouping of community types on or near the water's edge. So if you start in the middle of your channel and move out right and move out left, where's the first time that you run into perennial vegetation, and what's the distance between that vegetation on each side? A lot of times we talk about wanting to narrow streams up or down, or however you want to say it, and the way you can kind of measure that is by looking at where that green line is. Is it coming in closer from each side, or is it still staying or wide, or is it getting wider? And then what type of plants do you have at that green line? When you go out in one direction or the other, do you find sedges and rushes? Do you find willows or cottonwood? Or are you going out and then you're finding rabbitbrush and sagebrush? That'll help give you an idea of where your stream is stability-wise, and then again compare that to what you think that should be at sort of a functional setting. And then the last leg of the stool here is soils. So we look at type and texture. So are we fine-grained, are we coarse-grained? Is it alluvial, colluvial, lacustrine deposits? How were they put there? What are the characteristics of it that allow water to move up, down, or through it? What are the characteristics of it that allow it to be eroded or resistant to erosion? And then what are the characteristics of it that allow vegetation to grow or not grow? And then there's a little bit of relationship there between what vegetation can grow and how that adds that organic matter back to the soil. I forget the exact numbers, but basically as organic matter in your soil material goes up, the water holding capacity of that soil goes up a pretty significant amount. So we want to make sure that if vegetation is supposed to be a part of that system, that we have enough of that vegetation cycling through to help maintain a healthy soil. So here's just an example where we've got some plants growing in the capillary fringe, and what that is we've got the stream water moving through connected to groundwater right adjacent, but based on the grain size and shape of that sediment there, it can actually pull water up through capillarity, and that water, even though it's kind of hanging on to all the little sand grains or silt grains, whatever happens to be there, it's still available to some extent for vegetation. So vegetation can actually grow up away from where the water is because of the characteristics of the soil. Again, getting back to this idea that a lot of these individual characteristics are interrelated. So you've got your hydrogeomorphology, right? So the water and the shape of your channel and of the watershed, and then climate and hydrology. So that's your inputs, how they change seasonally, annually, or over a longer period. How those two things affect which vegetation can or can't grow, how the vegetation affects the soil that is being built up on site, or whether it's being eroded. If you start to lose your vegetation, you start to lose your soils, that geomorphology of the site changes. So they all come back around and they can kind of impact each other. Climate and hydrology is really the one driver that's not as affected by the other three. So what we're going to go into now is just a quick definition of what Lotic is. So it's running water, so rivers, streams, some springs. The cutoff that I like to use for springs is if you have a spring brook and you've gotten to the point where you actually have sort of a fluvial system or an alluvial system where the stream or the spring brook is moving sediment as much as it's depositing sediment, and you've got that sort of redistribution of sediments through that area, then I would consider that Lotic. In spring brooks where water's just sort of flowing over the surface and you don't have a lot of redistribution of sediments, and it's flowing through sediments that were there before there was a spring, then you may want to consider that lentic. So what's the definition of a Lotic site at PFC? So a Lotic riparian area is considered to be in proper functioning condition or functioning properly when adequate vegetation, landform, or woody material is present to 1, dissipate stream energy associated with high water flow, thereby reducing erosion and improving water quality. 2, capture sediment and aid floodplain development. 3, improve floodwater retention and groundwater recharge. Number 4, develop root masses that stabilize stream banks against erosion. Number 5, maintain channel characteristics. And if you have all that, a riparian area in PFC will in turn provide associated values. So when we get the form and the function, then we start getting the things out of that area that we usually think of as the good parts of a stream: the vegetation, the wildlife, shade, forage, high water quality, those sorts of things. So riparian areas function properly when adequate structure provides the benefits. So we're looking at channel form and floodplain form and function, and then vegetative form too. What do they add to that? And we base all this analysis on the idea of potential of the site, and that's where having an ID team that's really informed about the types of systems you have locally or regionally is important, because we don't want to assess Nevada streams against what people assume a stream should look like if they were, educated in the Northeast like I was. So if the system isn't going to have cottonwoods or pine trees throughout the riparian area, you don't knock it down because it doesn't have that. If any one of those things that's in the Lotic PFC definition isn't possible based on your site, then you don't call it non-functioning because it's not there. It can still be functional based on what that potential definition is. So again, an example, if it doesn't have the potential to support what he seeks use, then we don't use that criteria. So here's just a quick example of a small stream that's in proper functioning condition. We've got stabilizing vegetation up to the edge of the bank. We've got a relatively narrow channel, deep, clear water. We don't see any erosion. And that fits into this idea of a stream channel evolution model. A more kind of current sort of term that you might use for this is sort of a state and transition model. There are people looking to come up with riparian versions of the state and transition models that are currently used for upland sites. But just looking at this evolution right here in state 1, we've got a narrow, deep channel with cohesive banks and wetland and riparian vegetation right up to the edge, fairly stable. It's maintaining a high water table. That's what that blue line represents. If you have some sort of stress through there, whether it's improper grazing or an extended period of drought or wildland fire, OHV use, whatever, you start to come up with some level of destabilization there. Then you get into an idea where that system is now no longer properly functioning, but potentially functioning at risk. You have the risk of losing what function you do have. In state 3, we've crossed some threshold. We've now had deep incision, so vertical erosion or vertical instability. Once you get to that point, you're going to usually keep eroding down until you hit some sort of more resistant layer, and then you're going to start eroding laterally. So that's getting into state 4, where we're now going from sort of a gully out into sort of what Roskin would call sort of an F channel, so really wide, really shallow. That's going to give you now the ability to start redepositing sediments. So there in state 5, we've started to deposit some sediments. We've started to recover some vegetation on there. We may still be in a non-functional system in state 5, or we may start getting into sort of that functional at risk where we're starting to recover again, but we're not yet fully there to a stable site. But if you do continue that upward trend, then you get back to a state 6 where you're now back at PFC, but it's a different PFC than you were up at state 1. And that gets you kind of to this altered potential where you would describe it as being an inset floodplain, you know, within sort of a drier terrace. So here's some photos showing how that evolution might work. So this channel here, we've got a little bit of erosion. You know, depending on what the vegetation is in there, we may be lacking some root structure in that. So here we're at functional at risk, right? We've still got some functions there. We've got some habitat. We've got the vegetation. We've still got some form in the channel. But we've got a little bit of erosion that gives us cause to worry. And if whatever the cause of that instability isn't addressed, we may start seeing some more additional erosion. And this is a different site, but just showing what that might look like, where you've had some down cutting. And then with the down cutting, you've got an associated change in water availability to the adjacent vegetation. That vegetation changes from wetland and riparian vegetation, which is more resistant, to more upland vegetation, which doesn't have the root structure. So then you start getting even further instability. You may end up with a situation like this where you've got a 10, 20, 30-foot gully. So the gentleman in the gray shirt there with the baseball cap, he's standing just on the upstream side of a head cut. If he were to take a couple of steps further, he'd be falling off into the gully that's being created by that head cut as that erosion moves upstream. And this is a pretty extreme example, but for those of us that work in Nevada, this isn't that uncommon to see something along these lines. And then once something cuts down that far, that next step was to widen. So we can see in this photo here, on the left-hand side, you see those vertical banks. They are still actively eroding. You don't see any of that sediment that has fallen off that bank staying down at the bottom at the water's edge. So we've got some widening occurring here. But concurrently, on the right-hand side, we do have some of that new vegetation building at that new inset floodplain level. So we're starting to get some of that function back, but we're still potentially here on that kind of verge between non-functional and functional risk. We still have some functions, but we still have a potential to lose them during a high flow. Here's kind of taking that another step further. We're starting to get vegetation even showing up at the bottom of those vertical banks, so we're able to dissipate a lot of that high flow energy based on that new floodplain that's developing. The willows are coming back in, showing some successional changes of the riparian vegetation there. And then this is kind of the next version of that.